Okay, this is a short clip which has part of my presentation for Vision Science Society, which I'll be giving in the Philosophy Satellite on Tuesday afternoon. And I wanted to give an initial taste of some of the issues that we'll be talking about with respect to attention, so that maybe we might have a couple of conversations if you're in Florida at PSS. So I'll give part of it. Comments will be given by Ruth Rosenholtz from MIT. And you can find either of us wandering the halls and the different sessions. Okay, the rest of the talk, the positive portion, I will give on site. So if you find any of this engaging, please comment in a Twitter thread or talk to me at the meeting. And come to the session for the last part. Okay. So I'm going to argue that we know what attention is. And I'm going to do this not by saying something crazy or controversial and trying to get you to believe it. Rather, you already know what attention is, and we all know the same thing. So I'm going to bring out this common assumption. I do this in the background of the fact that we know a lot about attention. So here's a PubMed search, attention in the title, 45,000 papers published since 1950. And you'll note at the peak here, 2022, there were nearly 4,000 papers. And this would suggest that we know what attention is. And yet, as many of you know, there's a lot of skepticism. So here's one. Someone says, I don't think we know what attention is. The concept is meaningless. Lots of things are called attention that are clearly different things. I'm sure lots of you have heard similar skepticism. Here's a second case. To the question, what is attention? There's not only no generally recognized answer, but the different attempts at a solution diverge in the most disturbing manner, right? There are too many answers. I think these are the same complaints, and I want to identify them as complaints about our theory. There's something wrong with our theory of attention. What I also want you to note is when these complaints were made. So Russell Poldrack said the following in 2018, that first one, Hargross in 1896. But notice the same complaint now, unanswered for over a century. All right, so I want to try and do better by answering them, but I want to note that I'm not cherry picking here. Here are two very nice articles, Britt Anderson's There is No Such Thing as Attention, and Bernard Hommel et al. Claiming no one knows what attention is. But look, if things are really this bad, what is going on here? If no one knows what it is, we mean many different things by it. One wants to question the unity of this research. So I'm going to push back. I'm going to argue that there is a common conception of attention. And my argument is logically simple. It begins with a true premise that we all accept a set of attention paradigms. We wouldn't be in this business of the science of attention if we didn't. And here's the important premise, that these paradigms imply a single conception of attention. It's part of the core of each and every one of these paradigms, such that if you accept the paradigms, you have to accept the core that they're built on. Okay, so that's going to be my argument. I want to emphasize that we need to talk about the world, so we can talk about attention, the thing, and talk about it being some identical to some X. But we can also make semantic claims. For example, we talk about the word, and now we can talk about meaning, and attention means X. I'm going to focus on talking about the phenomenon and not about the word. And I emphasize this because I'm often accused of playing mere semantics, word games, or just legislating how people should use the word attention. This blocks us dealing with the logical problems in the theory. And worse yet, it's based on a confusion between use and mention. So I want to explain this clearly because the conflation happens often enough. If we want to talk about words, we have a device. We quote the word, and that creates a name that refers to a linguistic entity. And then that way we mention the word attention. But science is not the theory of words except for linguistics. And cognitive science uses terms to talk about the world. So we use the word attention, now in quotes, to talk about attention, the thing. And notice that in the second use here of attention, that is unquoted. So in all the slides that you'll see, for almost every instance of the word attention, it will be unquoted and the claims made will be about the biological phenomenon. So don't confuse use for mention. Okay? Now, of course, there are semantic consequences, but the primary focus is on the psychological phenomenon. So let's go back to these two claims and extract the two main problems. The first one is a worry about ignorance. No one knows what attention is. And the second is, I'll put this in terms of words. There's an ambiguity. The word attention, notice quoted, means too many things. That's a semantical claim. I'm going to set aside ignorance firmly in what follows, but I want to deal with ambiguity first. And I want to point out that when we think that it's a problem about words, then we think it's merely verbal. But in fact, the theory of attention is logically flawed. It is internally inconsistent. By theory of attention, I'm just going to conjoin the many reasonable and commonly affirmed claims about attention that are out there in the literature. And to show you that the theory is inconsistent, I will derive contradictions from the theory. Here's the form of the argument. This is the first horn of the dilemma. People say that attention is equal to X. It is X. It is Y, according to some other people. For some of these X's and Y's, X and Y are non-identical. And then you can derive X is equal to Y. And that contradicts the third premise. I want you to feel the force of that. It's like deriving tigers are daffodils. Or you can also derive that attention is not equal to attention, right? Just simple algebra, identity manipulations. So here's a concrete example. Lots of people that say that attention is some kind of internal mechanism or process. You can fill in your favorite there. You might say it's the process of FEF modulating information processing at V4. Lots of people say that attention is a limited resource. Processes are not resources because processes use resources. They don't covary. And therefore, you can derive the contradiction. In this case, you can derive attention is not equal to attention. Okay, so notice that this is not a claim about words. This is a claim about how we divide psychological reality. Let me give you a second example, divisive normalization. Well, this is a computational theory that tries to explain changes in neural activity on the basis of attention. I take divisive normalization here, Reynolds and Heger's model, as an implementation of the idea of bias competition. And so really, I'm not going to explain this here, but all you're seeing here is a shift, a change in gain of certain neurons that are tied to the task-relevant object. You have competition in the sense of divisive normalization. There's a kind of suppression of competition of neurons for limited resources. And then here you have the bias. Okay, the bias here, you might say, reflects the task-relevant targets, the spatial bias. Okay, this would be what we metaphorically call the attentional spotlight. For example, this might be a signal from the frontal eye field on V4 populations of neurons responding to a task array. All right, so this is attention here is manipulating neural processing. Attention is a spotlight, it's a cause. This is in fact not Desmond and Duncan's view. So in 1995, when they presented the view, they took their view to be different from the standard view. What's that view? Standard view is the mental spotlight. Attention is this internal mechanism that changes the processing of neurons, just like we saw in divisive normalization. This is not their view. The view is, in fact, that attention is the result of the resolution of competition of processing that controls behavior. Okay. I'm going to put this as follows. On the standard view, given the divisive normalization model, attention is like the spotlight. But again, that's a metaphor. Attention is an internal mechanism that causes and resolves competition. On the Desmond and Duncan view, that same process outputs attention. Right? And in this context, cause is not equal to effect, and so attention is not equal to attention. All right, so I've given you two examples of internal inconsistency. That sort of inconsistency dooms mathematical theories, and it should doom any theory. Okay? So the problem here is not about words. It is the fact that we've divided reality incoherently. Now, there is an alternative. I think this is problematic, but I don't have time to show you why it is, but I do want to note it, which is that going back to this case, you might say that what we have here are two different kinds of attention. And if you say that, then you can't derive the contradiction. You can't say that tigers are daffodils because tigers aren't daffodils. Attention 1 is not equal to attention 2. Now, what I just want you to notice is that if you go and randomly sample papers, especially in the last 30 years, what people say about attention in the same paper, they will affirm premise 1 and premise 2, and yet not notice that, in fact, they ought to be talking and clearly demarcating two different kinds of things. In other words, they're equivocating. So a standard conceptualization of attention in many papers teeters between contradiction, which I showed you, or equivocation, a failure to draw this distinction. Now, I don't think we should draw that distinction. I think there's different kinds of attention of this sort. But again, what I want to do here now is move on to the thing that we all believe, what I'll call the common conception. And this was just articulated by William James a long time ago in this well-known characterization. I have three arguments here for why we're committed to the Jamesian view. The first is that it's just right. So if you just pull away your theoretical predispositions here about attention and just listen to the words here, I think this obviously is attention. What are you doing when you attend? For example, to my voice right now. Your mind in audition is taking possession of one of several objects or trains of thoughts. Here's perceptual and cognitive attention. And you do this by withdrawing from distractors to deal with what you're selecting. If that isn't attention, I don't know what is. Okay? It's a subject's attention. So I'm going to express this less elegantly in my prose as a sufficient condition. If an animal subject selects a target to deal with, to guide their response, say an experimental task, to act on, then the subject attends to T. Okay? That's just an extraction of the Jamesian idea. So the first point is that James got it right. That description sounds correct. And this is a way of expressing it. Here's a second reason to accept James. Many of us accept something very close to it, except that this answer, the standard one, is demonstrably false. Here's the answer. Should sound familiar. Most papers say it. Attention is selection of information for further processing. Now, I'm going to show you that it's false by giving you a counterexample. I just need one counterexample. You may not like this counterexample. It doesn't really matter. You can generate tons of these counterexamples, and I'll show you why in a moment. But here's a counterexample. Consider the retina. Here's the sort of tuning profile, the rods and cones in the retina. So what you have here is a biological fact. Is the retina selecting information of light of particular wavelengths for further processing. Vision, seeing, depends on this initial informational selection. But then by simple logical argument, it follows that the retina is attending to the light. I don't think anyone that I've come across would claim that the retina is attending to the light. Here's the argument, right? You start off with the standard account, that's premise 1. Premise 2 is a biological fact. You derive the false claim, retina attends to light. This is a logically valid argument. Premises, if true, have to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So if the conclusion is false, one of the premises is false. We know that 2 is true, it's a biological fact. And so therefore we counterexample, we reject the standard answer. Now, again, don't get tripped up by that particular counterexample, because I think it's really clear what's wrong with this account. It's too broad. It makes everything attention. There's lots of information processing that has nothing to do with attention. So you might think that James is making that mistake, right? He's talking about selection, this first part. But in a part of the quote that is often left out, you might take a look at some of these quotations in the literature. He narrows selection. It's not selection for any old processing. It's selection in order to deal effectively with others. Okay? Selection for the control. Okay, now, this is, I think, the most important one. It just shows that we're already committed to this. Okay? And we're committed to this first because we're committed to a certain very powerful and productive experimental set of paradigms. And the second is, and this is the critical part, that these paradigms imply a particular conception of attention. So what conception? The Jamesian one, which I'll call selection for action. And what I'm going to do now is argue for the second premise, because the first premise is true if you buy into the science. So how do you argue for the second premise? I want to begin with a methodological point. If you're doing an experiment on attention, that experiment's only going to be useful, give you good data, if your subjects are consistently paying attention in the right way. Okay? So you're probing attention only if the subject's not mind-wandering, unless you're studying mind-wandering, not thinking about dinner and so forth. They have to be deploying attention to the target. It could be a particular feature, gabor, could be, in spatial cueing, visual search. Now, how do you guarantee that? You don't leave it up to the subject. you build it into the task structure. The idea, now this is an ideal, it's a norm. The goal is this: you're going to make it a necessary condition of correct task performance that the subject selects the requisite target to generate the appropriate response, right? And you build that into the task structure, right? If the subject fails to do that, they will not perform the task correctly. And therefore, monitoring correct performance is a way of identifying when the subject is doing the selection. Okay. Now, this selection, of course, is the way that you set their attention, given the first point. You need to ensure that they deploy attention the right way, you build it into the task. Further, given this structure, you know how to build new attention paradigms. And if you present that, people will recognize that as an attentional paradigm. So in other words, this idea of selecting for tasks, this Jamesian idea, is a standard for constructing new paradigms. So I'm going to put this in terms of an empirical sufficient condition. And again, this is meant to be what we're all committed to. So when in any of these tasks that we think about, when a subject selects a target to respond to, as per task instructions, the subject is attending to that target. If you reject this, if anyone rejects this, then they're rejecting all the paradigms that are built on this idea. And you can fill in your variables for T, which will be each and every one of those P's. Or on the flip side, when you accept the paradigms, you thereby accept this sufficient condition on which those paradigms are built. And that's my second premise here. But here's what I want you to notice. This is not controversial. We accept the paradigms. That means that we already have a shared starting point in terms of what attention is. Two examples, but every paradigm fits in. Dichotic listening. I choose this even though it's an auditory case because it was really the first paradigm. People are very interested in the unattended channel versus the attended channel. What makes this the attended channel? The task instruction. The subject is asked to select one of the two verbal streams over the other, Jameson's one versus other, selecting this to deal with, that is, repeat the words correctly, okay? And now you've opened up an attentional channel. Okay, so that's auditory attention to the left verbal stream. Here's just another case, the attentional blink. Rapid serial presentation of symbols. Let's say that you're asked to report on the targets. And so what's required here is selection of the symbol, the letter, to store in working memory, and then later to extract that from working memory to report, okay? And the attentional blink is that under conditions in which subjects select T1, depending on the interval here, the T1, T2 separation, they sometimes fail to select T2. Perhaps they fail to encode into memory, or they fail to extract it, okay? But either one, the failure of that is attention failing, i.e. attention blink. Okay. And here's the point. To understand the very idea of the attentional blink, we draw on the basic sufficient condition of selecting this target for task. So this is the Jamesian idea. And what I want you to note is that for any given experimental task, the empirical sufficient condition is just a special instance of the Jamesian idea. And this, I just want to emphasize, is we should treat not as a definition of a word. You will note that, again, attention doesn't appear in quotes, but in fact that this is an axiom in our theory. It fixes for us what attention is in the study of attention. Further, it's also a normative ideal in the design of experimental tests. Okay, so let me just emphasize then that we all know what attention is, and James was right. But in the science of attention, it's fixed precisely because our paradigms and the data that we derive from it are built on it. All right, so I'm going to end there, but invite you to the session where I'm going to then spin out positive consequences for what this means for the theory. And in that sense, I'm going to celebrate the remarkable work done by empirical scientists on attention and show you how the Jamesian account unifies this. And the last thing I'll leave you with is the critical point, which is that attention should not be understood as an explainer. It is not a causal mechanism. And I know that's going to rub people the wrong way, but please come and argue about it or make objections in Twitter. Okay, thank you very much.